Welcome to the Leadership Passport, and I'm delighted to welcome my special guest today, Dr. Steffen Sommer. Stefan is the Director General of Misk Schools based in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. A polyglot and high-performance learning expert, Dr. Sommer has over 25 years school leadership experience from across Europe and the Middle East. He joined Misk Schools in 2022 from Doha College, where he was principal for 7 years. He has led top international schools in The Hague, Paris, Lausanne, and was head of languages at the Rugby School, one of the UK's top independent boarding schools. Dr. Sommer is active on the world education stage, is vice chair of COBIS, and was named one of the PI's 50 Voices of 2025 International Schools Edition. He holds a PhD in translation studies. Welcome, Stefan.
Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you for having me. That was a very generous introduction, I've got to say. Thank you.
So you shared with me a little bit earlier that you've lived in 8 different countries around the world so far. I wonder which of those experiences was the most surprising for you?
The most defining one was living in the UK. I lived in the UK from 1992 until 2006. And I've made it my home, so I live in London now. My European home is in London. And it's been the most defining one because considering where I grew up and what my education looked like up to university or my first degree at university, I was mesmerized by British education really when I came into it. And I remember my interview at Rugby School when the headmaster, Michael Maver at the time, he died in the early 2000s, when he asked me all sorts of things in the interview, but he said, "But do you have any questions for me?" And I said, "Well, I don't really understand the notion of independent school. So what is that? What's the difference between independent school and a normal school?" And he said, "That's an interesting question. I hadn't ever been asked that." And he said, "Well, look, it is like that. If I, as the headmaster of Rugby School, decide tomorrow that we'll discontinue mathematics and replace it by needlework, and my parents agree, then that's what we're going to do." And, that stuck with me for the rest of my life because it defined for me the essence of what has made British education so popular, so versatile, and also so successful throughout the ages. I'll come back to that in a second. And that is really its liberalism and that of choice. And don't forget, I was born and raised in Eastern Europe, spent a lot of time in Russia, in East Germany, and even nowadays in Europe, in Western Europe, be it France, Germany, Spain, it would be inconceivable for a headmaster to make any substantial decision on anything to do with the curriculum. I mean, certainly you could not discontinue a major subject. Now, that's, of course, nowadays also not so easily possible anymore in the UK because we brought in the national curriculum. And in those days, the national curriculum was not compulsory for private schools. Now certain things are. But it just taught me a lot. And that, having experienced a number of different education systems in my own upbringing, in my career, it made me realize, gosh, there's something, nothing's ever perfect, but there's something here that how free can a country be for a government to allow headmasters of a school to decide what they're going to teach. And you know what I'm talking about. Having been educated in Eastern Europe, can you imagine Germany would have thought immediately, well, there could be a little Hitler all of a sudden teaching all these Nazis. It would have been inconceivable. It was inconceivable historically. But it taught me also a lot about freedom. It taught me a lot about sort of why Britain is the mother of democracy, why people are like they are in Britain and so different from what we're used to in Europe, and also, in fact, up until the most recent times, that there was such a cry out in the UK to have Brexit. It was the longing for all of that, to have that back, this freedom, and to make own decisions. Whether that was right or wrong, that's a different agenda altogether. But it's so beyond that. Really was the most. It shaped my career and my understanding of everything most out of all the places I lived.
Amazing. Fantastic. So before we talk a little bit more about your particular leadership journey, wondering if your leadership style was a song or a movie, what would it be and why?
Oh dear. It's difficult to say. There's a side of me thinking, take it easy, but it doesn't capture it all because Uh, my leadership style, it's different depending on the situation. And don't forget, I've been in very different leadership situations in my life. I was a leader when I was in the army, in an Eastern Bloc army. I was a leader, although at a very low level, when I was at university, but in fact, at two different universities. But then also in very different leadership roles in teaching up to headship, and all of those different scenarios required a different style. But even in teaching and as a head, every situation requires a different style. But my regular style is consultative, and one that always makes sure that people feel at ease in their own positions, and therefore enables me to get the most out of them. And that is not only staff; there's the entire community. There's also students, and there's parents, and often, certainly schools like Misk schools, or in fact any of the international schools I ran, or indeed schools in the UK, are very much communities as well that sort of serve a wider community as well, are very much a hub, and everyone needs to feel at ease with what's happening in there, because the kind of students that you educate, that you produce as a result of the education that you provide in the school, will be part of that community or any other community, and therefore it reflects back on that community where they come from. And that's really how I see it. I see my whole style of operating, of leadership, a bit as a legacy. I want to make sure that what I've given those students, they will carry out and do something similar, not necessarily trying to copy what I do, but adapt what they have received themselves to keep them happy during their journey, adapt that to their situation, and pass that onto the next. Because I do think that positivity of mind is very important for future success in whatever you do. And when I talk about positivity of mind, I do mean that resilience and perseverance that you, in fact, those are high performance learning qualities that I think need to be inherent in anyone who wants to be successful in the 21st century, in doing anything, in any leadership role, whatever. And in a way, you see, when we talk about leadership roles, I do believe that, in fact, all our roles, we're all leading something. And even if it's leading systems or things, it's not always people. But in this day and age, given the complexity of society, we are all leaders in our own ways.
Mm. So, what inspired you to become involved in international school leadership and work your way to headship?
Well, it's a lot of things actually. It's I never envisaged when I went to university that I would be a teacher, but I've always seen myself as a natural teacher. I've always loved it. I always loved sort of explaining things. I always loved sort of. I found it quite easy in school and beyond to understand big concepts, and I always loved it to break them down and explain them to people so that they could also understand that. So I've always thought myself as a natural teacher. So even when I was at university, and I certainly didn't want to be a teacher then, or didn't that wasn't my intention to be a teacher. But I helped so many others that had difficulties with all sorts of stuff that we were doing at university, and that was fine. I was members of clubs and societies, and always helped others understand things. And it was also the times when things weren't going particularly well in the communist countries, and it's conceptualizing these changes, and we knew well before it did happen that that changes were afoot. It can't be. So my dad always says it's only a matter of time, and the time then came more quickly than we ever thought it was possible. So it's yes, and that kind of so that inner conviction was always there, although the active intent wasn't there. But then when I was through university, and I first worked in business, but when I worked in business in France, used to work for Peugeot. I was the logistics manager for the Eastern European markets when they all opened up, and it's to me, it was quite clear that one day I would want to be in teaching, because even there, I took real pride in sort of making sure when the training had to be in France, because at formation continue, when we had to do training sessions, I always loved this, and when the opportunity arose, I jumped ship, and I could do that because I had at university, because I always thought of myself as a natural teacher. I did do a teaching qualification because I thought, well, that can always be useful for something, and we'll see. And it wasn't a lot of extra time that had to be spent on that at the university where I was, and that came in handy then. So I could jump ship and did.
Fantastic. And throughout your leadership journey, can you identify a defining moment that's sort of something, a flip of a switch, or something that really stood out to you?
Several. It's I mean, don't forget, I was a housemaster for quite some time at Rugby, and I was quite young in those days. And initially, I thought, well, you know, uh, uh, not having studied at university pedagogy, which a lot of people were there who had degrees in education, which I didn't have in those days. So I thought, well, actually, I don't know if I can do this. But I remember Michael Maver when he said, "Oh, I'm sure you've survived the army as a leader, so I'm pretty sure you'll be fine running a boarding house at Rugby School." And actually, what I learned there was really quite extraordinary. It's because a lot of the skills that I did learn in the army came in very handy, and I tell you what that was. When I was in the army, I was very young, and I became an officer when I was only 21, and I and some of the people in the platoon that in my first leadership role in the army that had to do, I was 21 and they were 30, 35 sometimes. So they're quite, you know, really mature men. And that was not easy. And there was nobody there who taught me how to do these things, what the principles were, what the strategy should be when situations arose. So that there was a rule book, and by the rule book you had to play, but the rule book didn't say those things, what you do in certain situations when the people play up, and that kind of thing. So you had to this sort of resilience and to be resourceful. It was just a necessity. You just had to be able to do it. Otherwise, you just wouldn't survive. And I obviously survived quite well. So, and these strategies that I developed there at that time came very handy when I was a boarding house master, because in the boarding house at the time, they started what is now sort of year 9. That's when they started, and then all the way into the upper sixth form until year 13. And they could be quite a handful. So it was difficult at times. Don't forget all these boys in one boarding house, 60 of them. That was not easy. But that was quite a test, and I liked it so much. Believe it or not, initially I thought, well, I wonder if I can do this. But eventually, I liked that so much that um, I would have liked to have stayed in the boarding house in many ways. My wife didn't like it so much, so we moved on, and I became deputy head them at the school, but it's at Sutton Valence School. But it was a defining moment, and actually quite interesting that Michael Maver in the interview said to me, "Well, you survived the army, so sure you'll survive the boarding house." And it was actually it was exactly like that. Not quite as I anticipated at the time, but the kind of skills that I picked up by necessity in the army became very useful when I was a boarding house master. But then there were other defining moments, of course. When I was a deputy head and I was there with Joe Davis, who was the headmaster of Sutton Valence School at the time, I had a wonderful time with him, and he taught me so much, so much. I mean, he shaped my headship skills, really. Joe Davis did at the time. He was the headmaster, and I was the deputy headmaster at Sutton Valence School, quite a large boarding school, almost the same age as Rugby, actually, going back to 1576 when Sutton Valence was founded. And we made it into a very, very good school. We refurbished the sports centre, the boarding houses. It became, it leapt up the league tables from third division into the first division. So we really did well there. But that again, you see, although it wasn't quite the same level of school when I arrived as Rugby was, it was the first time that I had responsibility for everyone, and Joe let me do a lot. He let me do a lot, and I brought a lot of changes. It cemented my interest in technology and the thinking ahead. We were the first there to introduce, believe it or not, that was in 2000 and in 2001 when I introduced the first version of the behavior management system. And I remember when I presented that to the board, and Joe Davis was there, he said, "Well, this is like the army here." And I thought, "Oh, no, yet again." But actually, now it is unthinkable that any school would not have a behavior management system. And at the time, I remember explaining to the board there how important it was to have statistics, to be able to say to parents, "Look, all these, there's a clear pattern there, and I'm not making it up because here's statistics. That's all the things that happen, that kind of thing." And at the time, there was quite some resistance on the board, and they felt, "Oh, we're turning into an army camp here. We shouldn't do this," and that type of thing. So it makes me proud that, and in those days, there wasn't even the likes of ISAMs and all these things that do this automatically. We used an MIS at the time called COBIS, doesn't exist anymore. And my IT department there in Sutton Valence was so good and keen. They built this module. and stuck it into the MIS at the time. So and nowadays it's common practice. Everybody would want to do it. So yes, so there were several milestones that that kind of inspired me more and more. And I stayed true to my vision at the time that the reason why I wanted to do different things at different schools is to reach more and more students and to have a real impact on their lives. And it's what really fascinated me, and I think that's the ultimate reward for a teacher. I left rugby so many years ago, but I can't tell you how many weddings I went to, christenings, university graduations, and all that kind of things that I remembered. And I always said to my wife, well, look, how important we must have been to that boy's life, that he felt it was important enough for us to be invited to the wedding. I mean, it's quite extraordinary, really. But it's where we came from. That would have been most, where we grew up. That would have been most unusual. So all these things defined me and defined my leadership as well, because it's what I last said, of course, also has to do with empathy of leadership, and that has to be there. There has to be in every leader, however well known you are, however successful you are, there has to be the empathy there, which has to be seen in your eyes and the way you speak and the way you handle the situation, that you always see the students as well as the parents, the families, as sort of a unit, as they're human beings. They're not being, they're not machines, and that's always appreciated in whatever which way.
Mm. And we were talking just before about some of the highlights and successes, and wondering about now some of the challenges. I'm wondering what's one of the toughest leadership challenges you might have faced, and how did you navigate it?
Mm. There were several tough leadership challenges. My last school before I came here was Doha College. Doha College was a very good school when I took it over in 2015. Was it 14 or 15? 14 or 15. In 15, I took it over. But the school had been planning. It was very successful, and the students were doing well. Qatar was a very small country. I mean, it's still a small country, but it was quite insignificant at that time, dare I say. It's certainly not now. But in those days, hardly anybody even knew where Qatar was. Now everybody does. And it was a school with enormous plans, because they had spent a lot of money on having a new campus designed. They wanted to be talking about for years and years and years, so much so that it became a joke within the staff. They thought, oh, we have this phantom that we all sort of think one day we will have, but it never come. So when the governors appointed me there, they said, well, we would really like to have you. Do you think you can build this campus? And I said, well, do you have a land? And they said, no. And we don't have any money either. So I said, well, but then we can try. We can try. And I've got to say, the biggest leadership challenge was that managing up the board, because they appointed me. And of course, they sometimes thought, they somehow thought we would have a campus. And of course, it's not like the school had nothing. The school had savings. There was quite a bit of money there that could be spent towards taking a loan and all that kind of thing. But none of that was easy, because the school is a British embassy school. When you take out a significant loan in a country like Qatar, normally the sponsor needs to countersign. The sponsor is the British ambassador. And I always thought, well, which British ambassador would sign for a loan for what is more or less £100 million against the taxpayer in the UK? That would not go down well. Anyway, so it's all that kind of thing. So these were big leadership challenges, because they have the staff. I want the staff to be on board, to remain at the top of the game as far as teaching and learning is concerned, as far as the standards in the school were concerned. I want to improve the school further, because it had real potential of becoming one of the top schools in the country, but at the same time trying to navigate my way through. I'm quite well versed with languages and get to know countries, and I got to know Qatar. In fact, I'm still very much connected to Qatar, because I got to know it so well. And we did, yes. So I did make connections, very good connections. We were given land, not given land, but we had to make sure we rent land. And then we took out a loan, and we didn't need the signature of the ambassador, because I knew the head of the bank so well that he said, well, for Doha College, you've proven that you've been a successful business for 40 years. And so it works. We built a new campus, and the school became a top school. But within that, there was a myriad of leadership challenges that nowadays, if I just say a few of them, yes, it was the pressure of having to build a new school when actually nothing was there, neither land nor anything, nor no money that had organized. But at the same time, which was a very good school, to make it a better school. And everybody in teaching, or anybody in school leadership, knows that making a low-performing school into a good school is not easy, but it's a straightforward journey. And if you go do it the right way, you can make big inroads very quickly, while making a good school into a great school is a very difficult job, because that's all about marginal gains. You're moving forward in very small steps, um, all of which will take a long time, all of which will take a lot of work, and not many people will see the difference that you're actually making. So it's a difficult job. So all of that at the same time, while of course taking the entire staff through exponential change, because the new school was more than double the size of the old school. Therefore, all of a sudden, what was a very cozy all-age school became a massive school. Therefore, as a teacher in that school for maybe 15, 20, or even more, many were there for more years, that all of a sudden changed your culture completely. So actually your job that you've loved for all those years became a very different job. Now from very early stage painted all of this. Yes, there's all this elation with all of this change, but don't forget, you will not recognize the school anymore. It will be a very different school. And that's quite scary. And it's and I've got to say, every single one of what sounds here like easy and straightforward decisions were not. They were, every single one of them was a major leap forward, but fraught with all sorts of challenges. Challenges on staff morale, challenges on well-being of students, of staff, of the community, and all of that. Because although there was, yes, the prospect of having a new campus, but there were, disappointments. There was pressure from the governors that there's only so much money, we can't possibly afford to spend more. We can't possibly be delayed, because by that time we were so popular that we recruited so many students that if that campus is not finished on time, what are we going to do with those students? Where are they going to go? And they don't fit into the old school. So it's all that kind of thing. All of which we did well on, and in the end, we finished the campus on time and hugely under budget, which in Qatar in its history had never happened before. So we had a quite successful story. But what I was going to say is, every success story has its challenges, and it's not true that, oh, you've been so successful in this and you achieved this and you achieved that. We mustn't forget when you're successful in the end, you tend to forget about the challenges that you encountered in your leadership journey towards that end game. And that's how we need to see the journey. Whenever there's a setback, whenever there's a challenge, when you scratch your head and you say, gosh, how on earth am I going to solve this? Will we ever be able to finish this or get there? One needs to remind oneself is, every success story has had a myriad of these challenges that were sometimes so bad that you were scratching your head thinking, gosh, how on earth are we going to solve this? But there's always a solution. And what's always helped in the solution is what I said at the beginning. It's empathy, it's teamwork. Yes, sometimes you have to be tough. Sometimes you have to be so tough that you kind of don't recognize yourself. That also happens sometimes, because particularly in the pandemic, when things were really, really tough, when we were also towards the end of building the school, that was not great. But it's at the end of the day, when we come out of these challenges and review, we always find out a positive mindset, which has led you to solving the problem and getting to the final successful outcome in the end. Has had its challenges, but also on the way made you stronger, made you more resilient as a leader, because it's added on to your wealth of experience that you already had. You then had more. I tell you, when I left Doha, I thought, well, what could happen now that I haven't seen, haven't dealt with? We built this new campus. It was done on time, under budget. In a country like Qatar, it's yes, it got ready for the World Cup. When everybody was building, it was not easy at all. Some materials were short because the World Cup sucked up everything. So it's and that type of thing. But it was similar here. When I came here, this state-of-the-art campus, which actually you wouldn't ever see a campus like this ever before. I mean, this is a 700 million pound campus. Can you imagine? It's just unthinkable. And that was only a fifth done when I arrived, and it was already delayed. So you know, I said, well, I'll try and finish it in the first year, and we did. And that, of course, is good, because it put my whole start of the job here on a very good footing. Because the one big thing I finished then very quickly. But it's hard, of course. I learned the trick here in the Middle East, and there's a way of doing it. But again, even the building industry, dare I say it, it is empathy. It is forming relationships. It's forming relationships in a different industry, with builders, with construction companies. That is not easy. And any school leader who is going into that, I would make one strong recommendation. Don't ever fall down the trap of appointing a main contractor and a consultant to run your building plan and think you'll be handed it over on time and on budget with a golden key. Ain't gonna happen. If you're not there every day, I can promise right from the outset it will be delayed, and it will cost more. It's easy as that. And I know we are all building something. It's schools are evolving bodies. We either build a new wing or a new theater or something, but whatever it is. But that takes quite some skill, and I think it takes quite something. It takes a good team, a very solid team, that you can actually focus on that, deliver on a high level project, while at the same time staying uh, at the top of the game academically and for the happiness of the children. And that takes a strong team, because what often happens is when schools are building something and renovating something, they go down academically because the focus of the whole school is on that. And I always made, even here, always made sure that no, it's nothing to do with you. You concentrate on teaching and learning. I've got my very small senior team that we concentrate on that. And that's all. That, don't worry about it until you can see where you're moving into and you need to make plans how to pack up your stuff. Don't worry about it. And I think that is the best way of going about it, because rather than getting staff all excited about something that might not be like they wanted to be anyway, and then forgetting about the importance of their jobs, that I always felt doesn't really help much. And that's why so many things could be achieved at the same time, I suppose. So every single job I've had, there were leadership challenges. I mean, even when I go back, when I ran Champité in Switzerland, and I was appointed there because they desperately needed a bilingual head, because in the school half the population spoke French, the other half spoke English. And I remembered, I said to the board, we had our own board, although it was a North Anglian school, but it's a very old school, very old Swiss school. I said to the board at the time, the problem here is not bilingualism. The problem here is biculturalism. What we define as a very good education, in coming from a British Anglophone background, is not considered a good education if you are a French speaker and you're coming from the French tradition of education. And that is the problem. That's why the school is a difficult one to do, and that's why you've had a series of different heads. So it's not about speaking two languages, which I do there, of course. I speak many languages, but it is about understanding what those people want and what the other people want. And matching those two is near impossible. So therefore, you need to make sure that you're virtually running two schools, but at the same time keeping two schools in one community. And that was then that really fixed the problem. That the recognition of the fact, well, we see greatness in different ways, but we're still one community. So it's and that then helped a lot. So there were challenges in every single area where I was. In France, in the British School of Paris, we built a new junior school. There was hardly any money there, so we had to sell the old junior school, which was in Bougival, in the impressionist village of Bougival. And that plan was all fantastic. But then, of course, the Lehman Brothers happened and the market collapsed. And we knew that our old junior school wouldn't quite fetch the many millions that we thought it would fetch. And so I've got to say, therefore, what I'm saying is, any head who is going into headship new, I always say, whatever you go into, there will be challenges. They might seem major or minor, but they will come with their own set of sub challenges that you will have to find a solution for, which are very, very much tailor-made for that particular scenario. There's no way of this is how you solve a problem. No, you will have to find a solution for that particular area that you need to do. Because schools, and I've always described them as organisms, because we have people in there, we've got different people. This school, for instance, here, I only have very high-level Saudis, but I only have Saudis here. So it's a very different culture here from Doha College, where I had a handful of Qataris. Everybody else was 90 something other nationalities. So it's a very different culture and a very different dynamics in the school. That doesn't mean that one is better than the other. It just means they're very different. So therefore, the whole dynamics of the school is so different that the diet, even making this school a top school, like I made Doha College a top school, the diet for that. When I was appointed here, the governor said, well, what's the recipe? I said, well, there isn't a recipe. And he said, well, how do you get there? I said, well, but how do you get there is quite simple, but the recipe is different. How do you get there is to make a top school, really you have to focus on one thing, and that is leaving nothing to chance. And when I say that, I mean leaving nothing to chance as if you are having a bunch of very good swimmers and you want to turn them into Olympians. Now, it is not good enough to be a top swimmer, to be an Olympic swimmer. You have to watch out for many other things as well. It's not only the hours of training, it's not only the quality of your coach, it's not only the quality of your facilities and the water and all of these things. It's also things that are seemingly completely irrelevant for swimming, yet they are very important. Which is psychology, the sleep pattern, the diet, or the metabolism, all of these kind of things, the medical care you get, and that needs to be superimposed on teaching. So every single aspect that we've got to deal with in the classroom, outside the classroom, that affects the students, their learning, as well as their parents, the relationship with their parents, the relationship with the students, the school's relationship with the parents, all of these things need to be right in order to produce a high-performing students. But if they are all right, they will be high performing, as I've proven in every single school, and that's the same here. But the detail is different because the cultures are different, and the organism is different.
And you were talking before a little bit about notions of resilience and perseverance. And I wonder if there's one mistake along your journey that's shaped your leadership approach.
It wasn't just one mistake. There was a string of mistakes, which I don't remember as mistakes. And do you know why? I'm very self-critical, and I know we make mistakes because we're human. And there is no human that gets everything right. But I've always surrounded myself with a team, and I've always been open with my team. And I said, look, when you're getting things wrong, I'll point it out because we're here on a mission. And my focus is on the mission. So please don't be offended when I point it out. But likewise, I won't be offended. I'm not very precious. I won't be offended if you tell me I don't think that's wrong. I might not agree with you, but I then explain why I don't agree with you. But I'd rather you said it than not say. And I've got to say, a lot of mistakes that we made. I mean, going back to Doha, when we built the new campus, I tell you, it's one thing after the next. I give you one bit. And I was blamed for it, of course. When we started tiling the swimming pool, and that's, of course, not quite the end, but it's a swimming pool of the sports center, 50-meter pool. We discovered it was 9 centimeters too short. And that was the head of PE who hadn't seen the swimming pool before. But as I said, I kept my school out of it. I did all of that. So when they started going around, I said, well, that's too short. I said, well, how do you mean it's too short? I said, well, you can't see. There's no measuring tape here. I said, well, I can see it. So we called in a company. I had them all available anyway because we were still building to have sort of the laser measurement. And it was indeed 9 centimeters too short. And he said, well, you do realize that we can't then run competitions here. And of course, we had such a big pool also to rent it out for competitions, to rent it and to make some money on it. I went back to the building company. I said, well, that needs to be fixed. He said, well, how do we fix this? I said, well, I don't know. You're the builders. I mean, find a fix. And that clearly was a mistake because when all these things happened, I mean, people who haven't built anything wouldn't know. But when the pool was handed over, I had to sign off that it had been handed over, and that should have been reported to the board. The board, had I reported that to the board, would have asked me for the details. Are the measurements correct? But it wasn't done, so I signed it off without doing it. That was a mistake. I mean, these things happen, in the myriad, the stuff, in the number of things. But actually, a mistake which cost very dearly, which in the end didn't because we made so many savings. We made much more savings on the whole project than that extra money cost. But at that time, this was just another cost that we had to deal with because people who don't know about the building things, but chipping off a bit of wall from a swimming pool inside is actually, even if it's only 9 centimeters, is actually not an easy thing because it's called a screed. Therefore, this is watertight already. So if you're shaving things off of a wall that's already watertight, you're taking the risk that the water it's now leaking. I tell you, when that pool was opened, it was indeed leaking. I tell you, the drama. So all of these things were mistakes. And of course, you have to, it's no point covering up for mistakes. A mistake's a mistake. And what I've always found is you have to own up to your mistakes. And that's what I've always, and I would like to think that my people always appreciated that. Certainly my board at the time appreciated the honesty that I owned up to and said, well, I should have told you that the pool is ready, but I just thought, we were under pressure time-wise, and I just thought it was important to get on with it, and we did. But anyway, we fixed it, and we found a solution. So I said I made there's a myriads of mistakes. It's also when it comes to employment, it's I remember certainly 2 occasions where I said goodbye to staff members that in hindsight I said, well, actually, we could have found a different solution, a better solution. That doesn't help in that situation. But I think it's also important for one's own soul to accept sometimes we make mistakes, sometimes we make mistakes that have a big impact. And yes, we have to live with it, but it's easier to live with it if you conceptualize it afterwards and said, well, what could I have done better? And that is interesting because that was the whole notion how I introduced this academic year, because we're now in the precision. The school's running like clockwork now, but we're in the precision phase to make sure that to be a top school, we have to be more precise in a number of things that we do. And I said one thing in that phase, which will take about 2 or 3 years. It's very important for us not to forget that we need to watch out every day if there are things that we do that we could do better. But we also need to remind each other if there are things that the other people have done that you think should have been done better, and the other people should be listening to that, and they shouldn't be offended. This is not a personal attack. It is just a clear indication we are here with a mission, and we have this particular aim. And to achieve that aim, this is not good enough. And please, and that's likewise for those who are in managing positions. If their lines, those people who we are managing, if they politely say, "Oh, I don't think that was a good decision," I don't think we should be offended. We should see this as an opportunity to reflect upon that decision. And I would like to think to be able to defend our decision because we have reflected well about it. But the circumstances could have changed so drastically that actually the decision we made yesterday could actually be quite wrong and potentially topple us over if we don't rectify it in one way or other. So that's another thing I think that always helped. That it helped during the building process and the transformational change in Doha, but also here that sort of this honesty. You also have to accept that not everybody will be happy with what you're doing. And I think it's very important to spell that out, that, with these changes, the same here. This school, we used to be the Palace, quite small when I first took over the school. Now we are in this new campus, which is absolutely enormous, 280,000 square meters. We've got a riding school, we've got a go-karting, we've got an Olympic swimming, Olympic a sports center. We've got 2 FIFA pitches. It is unbelievable in size and what we've got available here. But that comes with its own problems. The site is so big that in a way we are almost divided by a common school in many ways. But that is just the way it is, and we have to accept that. And we can moan about it, and it's very important to keep being honest about the things, what the future, once you are embarking on this change, to remind staff what it will look like when the change is complete and what their jobs will look like, so that over time they can get used to it and be part of that change and see us moving towards it. I think the biggest mistake maybe I made in Doha, although I tried very hard to do it that way, that some people, not all of them, but some people felt left out a little bit and felt they were all of a sudden in the situation of having this completely new environment, although they were told, they hadn't quite envisaged what it might look like until the day when they arrived there. And it's all very new and glitzy, but all of a sudden so different that they felt rather out of place.
Yeah. Is there a particular leadership practice or habit that's changed the game for you?
I have always, throughout my leadership journey, I've always had role models, and I think it's quite important that we have them. That we admire some people, how they do things, how they navigate things, although we might not actually know them well when it comes to their actual leadership style, how they manage difficult situations. But what we read about them and what they have achieved over time, and sometimes we idolize what from the basis of what people have achieved, how great a leader they must have been. And I've realized whatever you've achieved, you will not always have been the greatest leader, but certainly you must have gotten the main junctions right in order to get to that result. But that doesn't mean that nobody on the way was offended or felt left out. However hard you tried to keep everybody on board and keep everybody happy. It's I've always worked on role models. I had a role model when I was a student. There was 2 or 3 of my teachers when I was very young I particularly liked. I've always stuck to that. And some of the thing, it was one of my teachers I don't know when I was about 8 or maybe 10 or so, said one thing to me. He said, also learning needs to be learned. And that stuck in my mind all the time. And it does. It's so true. It is so true. Not all, and we know it now with all different learning styles, with dyslexia, dyspraxia, all of these things. And children don't all learn the same way, but we do need to learn how to learn as well. And therefore, there needs to be someone who teaches us how to learn. And the progress we've made in the educational journey, that is not uniform anymore. It's not one size fits all anymore. That is, we've come a very long way. Not in all countries, mind you, not even in Europe, but certainly in the UK and the international education, we've made massive progress in this, doing that. But others as well. It's if I go back to Rugby School to Michael Maver, I mean, I idolized him very, very much so, and I tell you why. Because I was there when he changed a school which was already 400 years old, over 400 years old, from a very traditional old boarding school, doing reasonably well, not very well, but reasonably well, but living on a big name, but changing it into a new era by making it a co-educational school, and that must have been hard. Can you imagine these old rugbyers in big positions back in the UK saying, "How dare you turn my boarding house into a girls' house?" I mean, in those days, I mean, people were much more homophobic in those days. It's this we don't seem to remember these days anymore. This was, and I admired that. I thought, this takes some guts to do this. And he did so well. This was the making of the modern rugby. I mean, nowadays, maybe some of my old colleagues wouldn't agree, but I've always seen him as the 20th century Dr. Arnold. Dr. Arnold, the famous headmaster of Rugby School of the 19th century, educational, really a think tank. Really, he was really a revolutionary in education in those days. I mean, he came up with the pastoral system, for instance, by saying education is all around these children. That everything they see, everything they touch, the way we talk, the way we walk, the way we dress, all of that's education for the children. That was his idea. And what we have nowadays, it's what we put on the walls. Even that's learning. That all goes back to Dr. Arnold. So Michael Maver was the 20th century version of that, and I admired that. I admired that very much. And it's those kind of things. I mean, I didn't turn any school from being a single sex school into into co-educational school. But for instance, in Holland, when I was the head there, I made the school a dual economy school, from being an A-level school into an A-level and IB school. And that was very rare. There were other schools. It was very rare in those days, because you can't slag off one in order to promote the other. You had to promote both, and you had to have a good strategy of making sure that you find the advantages, the pros and cons in both, and advise parents correctly and students on which pathway would be the best for them. But I always remember those words. So having a role model and having someone to model yourself on, I think is a very important trait if you want to be a good leader. And also, you see, leadership is one of those things that you can't really step out of. Once you are, it's kind of with you all the time. You have this responsibility. You carry it all the time. Sometimes, I suppose, at the expense of my own well-being, but it's I can't really let go easily. I'm always there, and I want to make sure I play safe. And it's that children who are on trips, or when we do summer courses here, and even at we've got very strong relationships with Stanford and with Cambridge, and we have sent students there. So it's I always want to be on top of it all, although I don't have to. I've got staff who could do this. But I think that's just another thing that that makes certainly your community realize that there's always someone who watches, even if it's limited what you can actually in reality watch, and you need many more people to do that.
Mm. So, speaking of role models now, what's one piece of advice you'd give to an aspiring school leader?
Well, I would always say one thing: running a school, running an international school, or running any school, and making that a success is not a job. It's a way of living. It will define you, because when you are shaping people for their future, it's just not something. It can't be a 9 to 5 job, and people who aren't teaching know that anyway. But that is, of course, equally true for leaders, because not only would you have responsibility for the well-being and the success of the students that you have there. And we all know that there's only one shot at education, and that shot needs to hit the target, ideally in the middle. But also a responsibility for the livelihood of everybody else, particularly in private schools, in fee-paying schools. That you have to run a business on top of running a school. So it's not just the expectation of what you achieve, but also how you position yourself in the market, how competitive you are, without being cutthroat about it, but it's that you define your unique selling point and you have your parents on board. So it is much more than a job. And I think to be successful as a head teacher, as a principal, or as me here, like me as a director of different schools, it's a vocation. It's a way of living. It becomes part of your life. It's a bit like my wife always said. It never really changed, although we left the boarding house, but life kind of stayed the same. It's always been school. It's life. It starts with school in the morning. It ends with school in the evening, and it's school in the holidays. It's school all the time. It's always something to do with school. I mean, I told you, I finished this campus here. They built a new campus in Doha. I've been in the Middle East for a long time. I had, in total, 4 complete summer holidays of my headship life that I spent in the Middle East. The complete summer holidays on building sites, the complete holidays. And that is just, I don't want to, what I'm saying is, if you are running a school and you want to be successful, and the business as well, it is a commitment. It is a commitment which sucks you in, as indeed when you run a private business, people who make their own businesses and make a lot of money while doing so, I always say one shouldn't ever be envious of business people who are very wealthy, because they would have taken a risk with their funds, and B, they would have spent a lot of time getting there, and they would have had many sleepless nights, and they would have spent a lot of effort to get there in the first place. So it's and that is of course also true for school leadership. It is exceptionally rewarding, as I said earlier. We've been to weddings, graduations, and so many of them. It's and I came away always with tears in my eyes, thinking, "Gosh, we've touched their lives so much that they thought it was important for us to be there." Those sort of pivotal moments in their lives, and that's encouraging, because we all know, all of us who are teachers know that we're giving them something that they can't be taken away again. It's for the rest of their lives. They'll have it with them, and the more effort we've made to make that enjoyable and a happy time, they will always remember that, and they remember us as the teachers that have inspired them. As I mentioned, the folks that have inspired me.
Amazing. So, a couple of quick questions to wrap things up. Your favorite book on leadership?
Have you read Diary of a CEO? That's a great one. It really, well, it's just out recently. It's though I like that a lot, because it's very funnily written, and it's full of very easily quotable things that you can just use for assemblies, for staff meetings, and that kind of thing. And that's only recently outside. James Conlon, I think his name is the author, but it's still in the bookshops now. It's very, very good. And there are many others that I've read. I'm particularly interested in sort of leadership for schools as businesses. Recently, in recent years, actually developed an interest in the work of Professor Osterwald. He's a Swiss, very famous, really management professor and economics guy, with very, very wise research on the success of businesses. And if you are able to translate that, what he calls products, into what education needs, it tells you quite a story, especially for those who are running private schools that are also businesses. Because as teachers, we're not, I mean, I had an advantage because I came from business initially. And that actually was a huge advantage. So I did understand balance sheets and the budgets and all of that. That came with me. I had that before I even came into teaching. But that could, for a lot of people who come from teaching into through the ranks of heads of departments or housemasters and deputy heads into headship, that can actually be quite a challenge. While we always have sort of finance directors and business directors and whatever they're called, bursars, it's you can't you sign it off. You are the final signature, and it never looks good if you don't quite understand what these numbers mean. And what I'm saying is, what I recommend for heads to do is um, uh, not to stop reading about leadership, but also start reading about business and economics, because these things are important to understand. Our schools now are multi-million businesses. They're not little businesses. So you are handling a lot of cash. So and it's parents' cash that you have a huge responsibility for. And we now know, especially in the UK, with the VAT coming in, parents are forking out a hell of a lot of cash after tax, and then on top of that, pay VAT and that kind of thing. So we have to use it wisely, but also for the betterment of the education that we provide, and for the facilities that are being used by the children for those for the education. So I think that is really wise. But throughout time, I've always enjoyed anything about leadership and business, and I think it's very important not to forget that. But also generally, and especially when I do assemblies for staff, or when I do talks, um, I I also follow what's going on in big companies, international companies. I think there's a lot to learn from the biography of Steve Jobs, Richard Branson. There's a lot to be learned from that, and I would strongly recommend that we shouldn't close our eyes to that. I think, but it's a mistake for principals and heads to only ever read about leadership in schools, and it's I think that's not quite right, because there's a lot of commonality between what we do in schools and what's being done in business. And I think we should keep our eyes wide open when it comes to successful businesses that weren't thought of ever to be successful. Because there are also a number of schools, especially in the UK, that in not so distant past were doing exceptionally well and aren't now. And I think it's quite important that we learn from those businesses as well, and see, well, why is it that we are not doing so well now? I'm also always very, very intrigued by any literature that comes out over sort of turning businesses around, they're failing businesses. I mean, I don't know if you've heard, but this whole this whole focus recently on product management, which is actually nothing to do with the management of the product, but it's to do with how do you manage your own product that you produce. Now, if you look at our product, it's being education, and how do you manage that? Who's involved directly, indirectly, and how are those people who are indirectly involved connected to this? Do they have actually a connection to the product? And if you just compare that, if you compare that in a school, to what extent is our finance department aware of the teaching strategies, of the philosophy that governs our school? If you translate it into business, successful businesses now, dare I say it, if you look at BMW, for instance, there would never be anyone working in BMW that doesn't know the full range, which ones are diesel, which ones are petrol, which ones are electric, and what the price ranges. They will know that. But it's they're trained on that all the time, and nothing's left to chance. And sometimes I wonder to what extent we are involving all the ancillaries, which aren't actually ancillaries. They're instrumental in keeping these businesses going, keeping them successful, are involved in what we're actually doing. And I think, and I completely subscribe to that the understanding of the core business is instrumental for anyone working in the business in whatever role that is.
Mm. Is there a particular thing you do daily that helps you to lead better?
Yes, I'm very sporty. I do sport every day, at least an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours every day. Yes, if I'm not doing fitness, then I swim or I run. I always do something. I've stayed very fit over the years, always have been from young, and I need it like the air to breathe. It's very good. It makes me feel happy, makes me feel fit, but also makes me feel healthy. So I do feel good in myself in that. And I think we do need to have these outlets. My dad, who is now very old, he always used to say, in order to be healthy, you need to raise up your heart at least once a day. And I think that's very true. It's however old you are, you ought to keep doing that until you're very old. Yeah.
100%. The strangest, weirdest, or funniest thing you've ever seen in a school?
Um. Well, weird things in a school. I've seen a lot of funny things. I don't think I've seen weird things. I think when I came in, I thought, well, how very odd to have this in a school. No, I don't think I've ever seen that. Although I've seen a lot of schools, mind you, because also in my role in COBIS, I go round. I've been around a lot of schools. I've never seen weird things. Let me just think quickly. I don't think so. Funny things, yes, but only ever when it was. Well, sometimes it was funny in the way sort of decorations were, but that was never really purpose. When I saw that was only ever happened abroad, one in a school in Azerbaijan and one in a school in Germany. Um, but it was not on purpose. It was because these schools were actually building something used for something else and became schools. And they so a lot of it still reminded you of it being a hospital in the past or something like that. That was quite funny, but nothing that was actually on purpose or accidentally. Certainly not weird, but funny in the way I can't really think of that. Times it's what seemed weird when I was in Switzerland, but nowadays it wasn't. It isn't anymore. When I was in Switzerland, not at my school, but at Aiglon College at the time, it was very common that the children every morning did meditation. Now that's absolutely normal. But in those days, when I first arrived there, that was absolutely abnormal. That was just not the thing to do. But they'd done it for a long time and done very well. And now, of course, many schools in Switzerland and beyond have now adopted that. So what used to look and sound and feel a bit odd some time ago has now become normality, like many other things. So it's a no. I can't think of anything that I thought at least not on purpose that was weird. But I've seen buildings that look very odd, but not on purpose, but because they were other things before.
Very good. And finally, to wrap things up, best advice you've ever received?
The best advice I ever received is um, it was really Michael Mavor, the headmaster of a rugby school at the time. Um, he once said to me, that was well before I became a head. Don't think he even, I mean, well before I became a head. He once said to me, "Do you know, I think the army turned you into a leader, and you'll kind of always be one." And I thought, and that was very kind of him to say. And I did I know that? I think I suppose I knew that, but I also saw that as a bit of encouragement that I should I should do that. But I think he was right. It's because many of the I told you this the story before that a lot of what I learned in the army I really put to the test at the boarding house just by because it just worked. It was exactly the same things that I needed, thinking on my feet. But that is really what the leadership experience was all the time. Although we've read a lot about leadership and we've experienced a lot about leadership, still you cannot ever get out of one thing, and that is you have to often think on your feet because you will be in situations that just haven't happened before. You just need to make the right decision at that time, and that sort of calmness and confidence in yourself and in your own leadership needs to be there at all times, particularly when it comes to crises and emergencies. And I've had emergencies. I've had a staff dying, very young staff. Who committed suicide in Paris, which was a huge drama. I've had a child dying in Doha, not in school, on holiday, but still, a child dying while being a student at the school. These things are major. These things are major. They are rocket through the community and take a long time to rebuild what you thought had already been built. But it's you start again, and the whole community will feel different after a drama like this. So there will always be moments when you have to think on your feet. I mean, some of the listeners will now say, "Well, I do that every day." It's true, and in this fast-moving world, you have to do that. But you do become experienced in it. So while you over time as a leader, you don't experiencing it anymore that you are now thinking on your feet because you have had so many such experiences that you can come back to quite an extensive toolkit. So and sometimes you combine your tools slightly differently in order to find a solution to it. But and that's of course also one of the challenges of it. I mean, all good and rewarding jobs and as I said it before, this is a vocation, are like that. They present you with new challenges every day that you need to find a solution to. Otherwise, I think we'd be bored.
Mm. Well, I think that's a wonderful place to leave it there. Thank you so much for joining me today, Stefan. It's been lovely to chat with you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thanks so much for listening to the episode. If you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe, like, follow, etc. Drop a comment below to let me know anything you'd like covered in upcoming episodes or suggestions for future guests. You can also connect with me on Instagram and LinkedIn.